a prime minister who can hug both the president of Ukraine and the president of Moscow 2 weeks apart and be accepted in both places. Yes, I'm still wiping the egg off my face because I was the one person in the parliamentary debate who actually criticized the Indian position at the time, back in February 22. We are not interested in the victory of one or the other. In fact, we try not to get involved when one or the other side is still pursuing victory.
And the foreign minister there was saying that you're an expert in peacekeeping forces. You've worked in this area. I just want to pick up on that point he's just made about, would that be something that India would consider or toy with or engage with?
Fortunately, anything I say doesn't engage India since I'm in the opposition and not in the government. But Espen is right. And in fact, when you go back to the earlier part of this conversation, when you talked about the middle powers and so on, how did peacekeeping come about? Well, the UN Charter doesn't mention peacekeeping. The UN Charter envisaged that the big powers that had won World War II would get together and impose peace around the world. And peacekeeping was supposed to be the militaries of the 5 big powers who constituted the permanent members of the Security Council. But once the Cold War started, that became impossible. And so Dag Hammarskjöld had the brilliance to actually find countries whom one could broadly in those days refer to as middle powers, including India, Canada, Ireland, countries like that, to actually step in and do the peacekeeping that the big powers no longer could because they didn't agree with each other. So our not being engaged in the conflicts of the Cold War was actually a major asset in peacekeeping. And that's why the catechism that Espen was summarizing evolved, that peacekeepers do not take sides. Our only side is peace itself. We are not interested in the victory of one or the other. In fact, we try not to get involved when one or the other side is still pursuing victory. It's when they have decided that they are ready for peace that peacekeepers come in. There's this wonderful old line from Brian Urquhart, the late great Brian Urquhart, who talked about never dive into an empty pool. That is, don't try and make peace when one or the other side is not ready for peace. But once they are ready, then Espen is quite right. I mean, in fact, the Russians have made it explicit that they will not accept European peacekeepers who belong to NATO countries. They say they will not have NATO troops policing the peace in Ukraine. Now, that's an open statement by the Russian government. So, since pretty much all of Europe seems to belong to NATO these days, even can't build Sweden, I don't know where we're going to go. I mean, you'll have to look beyond Europe for your peacekeepers in Europe. And that may well be something that you would want to turn to India for. And certainly, speaking as an Indian parliamentarian, I don't think there's going to be a lot of resistance to that idea. I think there was resistance famously when there was a request at one point in 2003 for India to send troops to Iraq. And Parliament got together and passed a resolution saying in no circumstances should Indian peacekeepers go to Iraq after the American invasion. I don't see that happening for Ukraine. I think that if it were necessary and there was an agreed peace, I think there would be some willingness to consider. But I can't speak for the government. I'm in the opposition.
I know you're in the opposition and you're not in government, but given the state of play right now with Russia and Ukraine and this conflict and President Trump's position, are you glad that India took the position it did? I mean, it carried on buying Russian oil and gas, for example.
Yes, I'm still wiping the egg off my face because I was the one person in the parliamentary debate who actually criticized the Indian position at the time, back in February 22, on the well-worn grounds that Espen will understand, because he and I talked about all this in my UN days, that there was a violation of the UN Charter, that there had been a violation of the principle of the inviolability of borders, of the sovereignty of a member state, namely Ukraine, and we had always stood for the inadmissibility of the use of force to settle international disputes, and all of those principles, I said, had been violated by one party, and we should have condemned it. Well, a couple of years later, 3 years later, it does look like I'm the one with egg on my face, because clearly the policy has meant that India has actually a prime minister who can hug both the president of Ukraine and the president of Moscow 2 weeks apart and be accepted in both places. And therefore, India is in a position where it can make a difference to a lasting peace, if it was so required, in ways that very few countries would be able to. And it's partially, I mean, again, going back to some of the things that Stephen Harper and Espen said, distance helps. The fact that we're not in Europe and we're not directly one way or the other threatened or benefiting from any change in territorial borders, for example. That helps. The fact that the two parties seem to be ready to agree to peace. The fact that there would presumably be some very serious international backing for an international peacekeeping venture. I mean, all of those things have to be borne in mind before you answer the question that you just asked, Yella. As an Indian government a person making such a decision, those considerations would really have to be uppermost before they say yes or no. But I can see it entirely possible that in these circumstances, India would say yes.
Fascinating.
Remember, India's got 250,000 peacekeepers in its history around the world.
Yeah.
It's participated in, God knows, 49 peacekeeping missions, I think, in its history. So this is a country with an extensive record of having gone out to places far removed from India's direct interests in order to serve the cause of peace.
Yeah.
So why not?
Yeah.